Kingdoms crumble, but commerce finds a way. The most enduring legacy of a great empire may not be its monuments or its laws, but the hidden pathways of trade it helped to create. These pathways often leave behind a strange and silent witness, ancient harbors now buried under centuries of mud, sand, and modern cities. By the end of this investigation, you will see history through a completely new lens, understanding how the flow of goods and ideas can outlive the mightiest throne. How can a port swallowed by the earth tell a story of economic survival? What secrets lie in the sediment of a forgotten dock? We will journey from the sun-baked coasts of Persia to the cold fjords of the north, uncovering how these lost harbors reveal trade systems with a life of their own. What does it mean for a connection to be stronger than a kingdom? A harbor was a living, breathing organism. Think of it not as a simple wooden dock, but as a complete and carefully engineered ecosystem, a machine built for connection. Its true purpose was to transform the chaotic, dangerous sea into a space of orderly exchange. This required a symphony of specialized structures, each with a critical role. Massive stone breakwaters reached out like protective arms to calm the waves, creating a placid pool safe for fragile ships. Alongside these were the quays, the sturdy shoulders of the harbor where vessels tied up to unload. But the goods couldn't just sit in the sun. Towering warehouses store grain, olive oil, and precious spices, protecting a kingdom's wealth from the elements and from thieves. Nearby, the customs house was the brain of the operation, where taxes were calculated, deals were recorded, and the economic pulse of the empire was measured. For military power, some harbors featured vast, roofed ship sheds, dry docks where warships were repaired and stored out of the water, a state secret as valuable as any weapon. And underpinning it all was a constant, vital need, a simple resource we might overlook: fresh water. A reliable spring or well within the harbor complex was non-negotiable, supplying thirsty crews after months at sea and preventing the spread of illness. So a harbor was far more than a place to park a boat. It was a convergence point, a critical node where goods, people, currencies, languages, religions, and technologies all met and mingled. It was a synapse in the global nervous system of trade. When such a place is buried, we aren't just losing old stones. We are obscuring a vital connection point, a hub of human activity that pulsed with life long after the kings who built it were gone. To understand why these harbors vanished and why finding them changes our view of history, we must first appreciate the sheer strategic gravity they held in their prime. These engineering marvels were not defeated by war or politics, but by far slower, more patient forces. The burial of a harbor is a gradual drama, a story written not in days but in centuries by the quiet collaboration of nature and human activity. Understanding this process is key to seeing why these sites become hidden archives. One of the most powerful natural sculptors is a river's own ambition. Over time, a river carries immense loads of silt and sand downstream, depositing this material at its mouth. This process, called progradation, means the coastline slowly but surely pushes outward into the sea. A harbor built on what was once a deep, open bay can find itself, over generations, stranded inland, its basins choked with sediment as the sea retreats from its doorstep. Combine this with broader coastal sedimentation, where waves and currents constantly shift sand along a shoreline, and you have a recipe for a port being silently smothered by the very land it was meant to connect to the water. Human hands, often unintentionally, accelerate this natural burial. Widespread deforestation in regions upstream, whether for agriculture, construction, or fuel, strips the land of its protective root systems. This dramatically increases soil erosion, sending catastrophic amounts of silt rushing down rivers and into waiting harbors. The magnificent port of Ephesus, in what is now Turkey, suffered this exact fate. As the hills around it were cleared, the Cayster River poured silt into the harbor, relentlessly pushing the coastline westward and stranding the city's economic heart. But sometimes the burial is deliberate. As cities grow and space becomes precious, the shallow, silted areas of an old harbor present a tantalizing opportunity for urban expansion. Communities would simply fill in the useless basin with rubble, soil, and refuse, building a new neighborhood directly on top of their maritime past. This creates a fascinating archaeological phenomenon known as a harbor sequence. Think of it like layers of a cake, or more accurately, a palimpsest, an ancient manuscript where old writing was scraped away to make room for new text, but faint traces of the original story remain underneath. A city might abandon its clogged harbor, construct a new one a short distance away where the water is still deep, and build over the old site. Centuries later, that second harbor might also silt up, leading to a third and a fourth. The result is a horizontal timeline of maritime ambition, a series of ports stacked beside and atop one another, each layer holding clues to a different era of trade and technology. This relentless cycle of creation, abandonment, and burial is what physically sealed these commercial hubs away from view, but it is also what preserved them, protecting their secrets from later disturbance and saving them for us to find. The silent burial of these ports presents a profound challenge. How do you find a harbor that has been missing for 1,000 years, especially when it lies beneath a bustling modern city or a featureless coastal plain? The answer lies in a remarkable fusion of disciplines, where archaeology meets the earth sciences in a high-tech detective story. This is the realm of geoarchaeology, a field that reads the landscape itself as a historical document. Unlike traditional terrestrial archaeology, which often focuses on digging up structures and artifacts, coastal geoarchaeology starts by asking the land what happened. It treats layers of sediment not as dirt to be removed, but as pages in a geological diary, each holding clues to ancient environments, sea levels, and human activity. To read this diary, scientists employ a suite of non-invasive tools that let them see through the ground. One of the most revealing is sediment coring. Imagine pushing a long, hollow tube deep into the earth, pulling up a cylindrical sample of everything it passes through. This core is a vertical timeline. A researcher can examine the layers, identifying sudden changes from marine sand full of seashells to layers of silt mixed with pottery shards and charcoal. That transition marks the moment a natural coastline was transformed into a bustling, man-made harbor, and later when it was abandoned and filled in. It is physical proof of a lost waterfront captured in a tube. For mapping larger structures buried under streets or fields, ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, is invaluable. This device sends radio waves into the ground and listens for the echoes. Different materials, like solid stone foundations or empty voids, reflect the waves back differently. By dragging a GPR unit over a site, researchers can create a detailed underground map, revealing the ghostly outlines of buried quays, warehouses, or breakwaters without ever breaking the soil. It is like giving the earth an X-ray. When the clues lie underwater off today's coastline, other tools take over. Side-scan sonar is towed behind a boat, sending out sound pulses to create a detailed, photograph-like image of the seafloor. It can identify unnatural shapes like the straight lines of a sunken breakwater or the scattered stones of a collapsed lighthouse hidden under seaweed and sand. To see even deeper into the layers beneath the seafloor, scientists use seismic refraction. This method involves sending powerful sound pulses into the seabed and analyzing how they bounce back from different sediment layers. It can reveal the ancient topography, showing where a deep, dredged harbour basin was carved into the bedrock, now completely invisible under centuries of mud. Together, these technologies allow researchers to reconstruct a lost maritime landscape with astonishing precision. They can trace the curve of an ancient shoreline now buried half a mile inland, map the full extent of a harbour that once held 100 ships, and understand the engineering that went into its construction. This is not guesswork, it is forensic cartography. By listening to the echoes in the earth and reading the stories in the mud, modern science gives voice to these silent, submerged worlds, setting the stage for the tangible evidence they left behind. The evidence pulled from the earth is compelling, but it truly comes alive when we visit a specific place, a ghost port that once thrummed with the commerce of continents. On the northern shore of the Persian Gulf, nestled between jagged mountains and the deep blue sea, lie the silent ruins of Siraf. For 3 centuries, from the 8th to the 10th, this was not a remote outpost but one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan ports on the planet, the vibrant sea gate of the legendary Silk Road. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, Siraf's merchants mastered the monsoon winds, building a commercial empire that stretched from the bustling markets of Baghdad all the way to the sophisticated ports of Tang Dynasty China. Their ships, massive dhows built from teak wood, departed with holds full of glassware, pearls, and luxurious textiles, returning months later with porcelain, silk, spices, and exotic woods. Excavations at the site have revealed the staggering scale of this wealth, from fragments of delicate Chinese celadon pottery to intricate ivory carvings and hoards of coins from distant realms. The city itself was a marvel of adaptation, with grand villas featuring wind-catching towers for cooling and elaborate cisterns to capture precious rainwater, all speaking of a society built on sophisticated, long-distance trade. Yet today you can walk to where its harbour once was and find only dry land. The story of Siraf's disappearance is a textbook example of the forces we have discussed. Its demise was a slow strangulation. Seismic activity along the region's fault lines likely damaged its crucial freshwater springs and aqueducts, the lifeblood of any port. More decisively, the relentless silt carried by mountain rivers began to clog its once deep anchorage. Year after year, the basin grew shallower, making it impossible for the large, deep-drafted merchant ships to safely approach. The economic machine gradually ground to a halt, but here is the crucial historical insight, the revelation that changes our perspective. The Abbasid Caliphate that fostered Siraf's rise eventually fragmented, its political power diffusing. Yet the vast, interconnected web of Indian Ocean trade it helped catalyze did not die. It was far more resilient than any single kingdom. When Siraf's harbour finally choked beyond use in the 10th century, the trade simply rerouted. The commerce in silks, spices, and ideas shifted to other ports along the coast, like Hormuz and later Basra. The system, the network of relationships, routes, and commercial knowledge, survived the loss of its premier node. The harbour was buried, but the highway of the sea remained open for business. This pattern of a network outliving its hubs leads us to an even more dramatic example, a harbour whose story is written not in silt, but in a sudden, catastrophic act of nature. The artifacts unearthed at Siraf are a catalogue of a connected world. In the dust of its collapsed warehouses, archaeologists find delicate shards of green celadon porcelain from kilns in distant China, proof of a demand so steady it crossed oceans. They uncover intricate carvings from African elephant ivory, destined for the workshops of Persian and Mesopotamian artisans. There are fragments of exquisite glassware, a specialty of the region, blown into forms that would be traded across the Indian Ocean. These are not random treasures, they are the physical signatures of a highly organized, predictable, and profitable system. The very existence of such fragile goods so far from their origins speaks to a mastered environment, from the expert shipbuilding that created sturdy, deep-hulled house capable of surviving monsoon voyages, to the established trade wind schedules that merchants followed like a maritime calendar. Siraf itself was a mosaic of cultures, home to Arab, Persian, Indian, and likely Chinese merchants, a community bound not by a single empire's flag, but by the universal language of commerce and credit. This is what the buried harbour ultimately reveals, not just a city's wealth, but the anatomy of a network. When Siraf's port finally silted shut, it was a severe blow, a critical node failing. But the network itself, this vast and adaptable web of routes, relationships, and commercial knowledge, proved astonishingly resilient. The lifeblood of trade simply found a new artery. Within a generation or two, the pivotal Indian Ocean commerce had shifted eastward along the coast to the island port of Hormuz, which itself would later be succeeded by Bandar Abbas. The goods still flowed, the ships still sailed, the profits were still made, just through a different gateway. This is the profound lesson written in Siraf's Sediment. The maritime Silk Road was a fluid, living system that persisted through the rise and fall of every land-based empire that tried to contain or control it. The harbour was buried, but the highway remained. While Siraf was a hub of private merchant empires, another kind of harbour was being carved into the earth with imperial ambition, one designed not just for profit but for survival. To understand the sheer scale of state-controlled trade, we must look to the heart of the ancient world's greatest empire and the artificial harbour that kept its heart beating. The city of Rome, at its peak, was a metropolis of over 1 million inhabitants, a colossal urban engine with an insatiable appetite. Its most critical vulnerability was not an invading army, but an empty stomach. The city's survival depended on a constant, massive influx of grain, primarily from the fertile fields of Egypt and North Africa. A few days of disrupted shipments could lead to unrest, a few weeks to famine and rebellion. The empire's original port at Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber River, was hopelessly inadequate for this task, its river mouth prone to silting and too small for the large grain freighters, the corbetti, that crossed the Mediterranean. Emperor Claudius in the 1st century made a decision of breathtaking scale. He would not just improve a harbour, he would will one into existence from nothing. Just north of Ostia, engineers began the audacious project of Portus, meaning simply the harbour. They dug a massive basin directly into the coastline, protected by 2 curving stone breakwaters that reached far out into the open sea. At the entrance, they sank an enormous ship, the obelisk carrier that Caligula had used to bring an Egyptian obelisk to Rome, filled it with concrete, and built a monumental lighthouse upon it, a fiery beacon on an artificial island guiding the empire's lifeline home. This was infrastructure as a statement of absolute power, a declaration that Rome would command the sea itself to secure its bread. But the true masterpiece came decades later under Emperor Trajan. Seeing the limitations of Claudius' single large basin, which could still be rough in storms, Trajan's engineers performed a feat of hydraulic surgery. They excavated an enormous hexagonal inner basin, landlocked and connected to the outer harbour by canals. This 6-sided lake, surrounded by towering warehouses, was a marvel of calm and efficiency. Ships could unload in the protected outer harbour, or be towed through the canals into this perfect geometric haven, where grain was transferred to barges for the final journey up the Tiber to Rome's granaries. This entire colossal machine served one primary, relentless purpose, the annona. This was the state-sponsored grain supply, a bureaucratic and logistical miracle. It was not merely a trade route, it was a public welfare system on an imperial scale. The government contracted shippers, maintained the fleet, managed the warehouses, and distributed grain subsidies to hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens. Portus was the physical choke point of this system, the valve through which the wealth of provinces was transformed into the stability of the capital. Every sack of wheat, every amphora of olive oil, that passed through its hexagonal basin was a direct transaction between the imperial state and its people, a delivery of peace purchased with engineering and organization. The silent, buried ruins of Portus today tell a story of trade engineered not for open exchange, but for controlled sustenance, a system where commerce was synonymous with control. The mighty hexagonal basin of Portus did not fall in a day or even a century. Its burial was a slow, relentless process, a geological fate written by the very river it was built to serve. The Tiber, carrying silt from the Apennine Mountains, constantly deposited this material into the harbor's intricate channels and basins. For the system to function, this was a battle that had to be fought and won every single year. A vast, organized workforce of dredgers and engineers was required, their labor funded by the deep coffers of the imperial state. Their task was simple and endless: to keep the arteries of commerce clear, to physically hold back the land from reclaiming the sea. For centuries, Rome had the will, the wealth, and the administrative muscle to wage this war. But in the 5th century, that centralized power began to fracture. Political instability, military pressures on distant frontiers, and profound economic shifts drained the resources and attention needed for such monumental upkeep. The meticulous, state-funded maintenance of Portus was no longer a priority. As imperial administration receded, so did the dredging crews. Year by year, the silt won. The canals that once buzzed with barges grew narrow and shallow. The great hexagonal basin, a marvel of geometric precision, began to fill in from the edges, transforming from a deep-water harbor into a stagnant marsh. The physical burial of the port was a direct symptom of a larger fragmentation. The Annona, that state-controlled grain supply that was the harbor's reason for being, depended on a unified Mediterranean, safe sea lanes, and a bureaucracy capable of moving mountains of wheat. As that political unity dissolved, the centralized system it supported dissolved with it. Portus did not just silt up, it was starved of purpose. Yet here is where the story becomes more nuanced and far more interesting. While the grand imperial trade system of Rome collapsed, the Mediterranean itself did not fall silent. The sea did not forget the routes mapped over 1,000 years. Regional networks, smaller in scale but resilient, persisted. Local trade in olive oil, wine, and pottery continued between North Africa, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula, just no longer funneled through a single, colossal state-owned port. The highway remained, but the traffic now moved in smaller convoys, serving local markets rather than an imperial capital. This reveals a crucial distinction between a trade system built by an empire for its own sustenance and the organic, decentralized networks of exchange that can adapt and survive political eclipse. One was an artery, and when the heart stopped, it clogged. The other was a capillary system, diffuse and harder to extinguish. To see a network that not only survived but thrived after its founding state vanished, we must look to a colder, more distant sea, where trade was not about feeding a metropolis but about connecting worlds. The silent fates of Portus and Siraf reveal two fundamentally different blueprints for civilization. One was a funnel, the other a web. The colossal harbor of Portus was the ultimate expression of a centripetal system. Every stone of its hexagonal basin, every canal, was engineered with a single, inward-pulling purpose: to concentrate the wealth of an empire toward its beating heart in Rome. It was a closed loop, a state monopoly where trade was not free enterprise but a calculated delivery of stability. The grain that flowed through its ports was a direct transaction between imperial power and the populace, a subsidy that purchased peace. When that centralized political order fragmented, when the administrative will and resources to fight the encroaching silt evaporated, the entire magnificent machine seized up. The burial of Portus is not just a geological event, it is the physical symbol of a top-down system collapsing when its central authority fails. The harbour died because the purpose for which it was built, feeding the Roman state, had vanished. Seraf tells the opposite story. It was never the sole destination, but a brilliant and powerful node in a vast, decentralized network. The Indian Ocean trade routes formed a polycentric web, a constellation of ports from East Africa to China, connected by monsoon winds and the shared language of commerce. No single empire owned this highway. It was a collaborative space of merchants, navigators, and financiers from countless cultures. Siraf's incredible wealth came from being a premier exchange point in this fluid, adaptable system. Therefore, when its harbour succumbed to silt and seismic shifts, the network itself did not unravel. It simply reconfigured. The lifeblood of trade, the silks, spices, and ideas, found a new path. The commerce shifted to Hormuz, then later to other ports. The loss of one node was a setback, not a catastrophe. The web healed around the absence. This is the profound resilience of a decentralized model. It has no single point of failure. Its strength lies in its multiplicity, in the countless alternative routes and relationships that can absorb a shock. So we begin to see a vital typology emerging from the mud. On one hand, centripetal systems like Portus are magnificent but brittle. They are built by and for political power, brilliant at concentrating resources but vulnerable to the fate of that power. On the other, polycentric networks, like the one Seraf belonged to, are diffuse and resilient. They are shaped by geography and opportunity more than by decree, and they possess an organic ability to adapt, reroute, and endure. This distinction forces us to ask a deeper question about what truly constitutes a civilization's legacy. Is it the monumental harbour built by an emperor's command, or the invisible pathways of exchange that outlast his reign? To find an answer, we must look to a place where this resilience was tested not by silt, but by ice, where a trade network survived the end of the world as its people knew it. Far to the south, where the warm waters of the Indian Ocean meet the East African shoreline, a different kind of maritime society took root. Here, the story of trade outlasting kingdoms is written not in the grand harbours of a single empire, but in a constellation of independent ports known as the Swahili stone towns. From around the 9th century onward, settlements like Manda and Shanga, on islands just off the coast of modern Kenya, began to flourish. They were not military outposts planted by a foreign power, nor were they designed to feed a distant capital. Instead, they were something remarkably self-sufficient and networked, autonomous city-states whose entire identity and wealth were forged by the sea. The evidence of their harbours is subtle but telling. Unlike the massive, dredged basins of Portus, these were ports adapted to their environment. At low tide, you can still see the remnants of tidal causeways, carefully laid pathways of coral rag that allowed small boats to navigate the shallow reefs and reach the shore. The towns themselves were built from this same coral stone, a local material that gave them their enduring name. But within these sturdy, local walls, archaeologists find a world of connections. Digging through the layers of Manda and Shanga reveals a stunning inventory of imports, fragments of Celadon and Esgraffito pottery from Persia, glassware from the Gulf, and coins minted in distant caliphates. These were not occasional treasures, but the everyday material of a society deeply integrated into the Indian Ocean's commercial lattice. A merchant in Shanga might walk on a causeway of local coral to a house built of the same stone, only to eat from a Chinese bowl and track his accounts with Islamic coins. This was the essence of the Swahili coast model, a society that looked outward to the ocean for its prosperity, while building a stable, sophisticated urban life on the shore. They were the vital nodes in a polycentric web, not subjects of an empire, but equal partners in a vast intercultural conversation of trade. Their resilience would soon be tested by a shadow rising from the very waters that connected them. The stratified mud of a Swahili harbour is a ledger written in earth and artifacts. When geoarchaeologists extract a core sample from the basin of a site like Manda, they are not just pulling up dirt, they are retrieving a chronological archive of its economic heartbeat. Each distinct layer represents a chapter in the port's life, a physical record of prosperity, challenge, and resilience that often contradicts or fills the gaps in written histories. The sequence tells a clear story. A thick, dark layer packed with fragments of imported Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, and Islamic coins signals a period of vibrant, high-volume trade. This is the sediment of a bustling waterfront, where goods were constantly handled, where amphorae broke and were swept aside, where the detritus of global exchange settled into the harbour mud. Then the story might change. The next layer could be a band of sterile sand or clean silt, largely devoid of cultural material. This is a silent chapter. It might indicate a period of decline when fewer ships called, or even a temporary abandonment of the harbour itself. Perhaps political turmoil far away in the Persian Gulf disrupted the supply chains, or a local conflict made the seas unsafe. The harbour's rhythm slowed, and the earth recorded that quiet. Later, a new layer rich with different artifacts appears, perhaps featuring distinctive Portuguese pottery or European glass. This marks a new phase, the port's adaptation to a changed world, finding its place within a new network of power. This stratigraphy provides something rare, a continuous, dated physical record of commercial activity. Written chronicles from the era are sparse and often focused on dynastic politics or religious events. The economic narrative, the daily pulse of connection and exchange, was rarely deemed worthy of parchment. But the harbour basin recorded it faithfully, year after year, season after season, in the pottery that fell from a dockworker's hands and the ballast stones dumped from a foreign ship. By reading these layers, scientists can pinpoint when trade with the Islamic world peaked, when Chinese ceramics first arrived in quantity, and when European influence began to reshape local economies. The buried harbour becomes a more reliable witness than any scribe, offering an unbroken account of how these coastal communities navigated the currents of global change, their prosperity literally layered into the landscape they called home. This resilience was not just theoretical, it was tested by history's most disruptive forces. The Swahili coast story is a masterclass in systemic longevity, a proof that a trade network can have a life of its own, independent of the kings and sultans who temporarily preside over its ports. The archaeological record from these buried harbours shows a pattern that defies simple political timelines. Individual city-states like Manda or Shanga would rise to prominence, their local dynasties flourishing for a century or two, only to fade as silting, local conflict, or shifting alliances altered their fortunes. A dynasty could fall, its palace fall into ruin, and yet the economic rhythm of the coast continued. The true power was not in a throne room, but in the seasonal wind. The monsoon cycle was the unchangeable calendar of this world. For 6 months, the winds blew steadily from the northeast, perfectly carrying ships from Arabia and India down to the African coast. Then they reversed, blowing from the southwest to carry those same ships, now laden with African goods, back home. This natural metronome created a system so reliable, so deeply ingrained, that it became the region's true governing force. It meant that demand for African gold from the interior, for ivory, for exotic hardwoods and ambergris was perpetual. As long as that demand existed, someone would find a way to meet it. The burial of an early port like Manda, therefore, was not an end. It was a transition. When one harbour became impractical, the network's logic simply elevated another. The focus of trade shifted south along the coast, to the magnificent island city of Kilwa-Kisiwani, which grew fabulously wealthy, controlling the gold trade from Sofala. Later, after Kilwa's own political star waned, the Sultanate of Zanzibar would emerge as the dominant commercial hub, its economy now tragically tied to new demands. This sequential prominence is the clearest evidence of the network's regenerative capacity. Even the violent shock of Portuguese arrival in the 16th century, with their cannons and attempts to control the spice trade, could not sever these ancient connections. The Portuguese wanted to insert themselves as the new middlemen, to tax and dominate, but the local Swahili merchants, the Indian financiers, and the Omani traders who later pushed the Portuguese out, all operated within the same enduring framework. They used the same monsoon schedules, sailed similar styles of dhows, and traded in many of the same commodities. The players and some of the ports changed, but the game itself, the fundamental system of exchange across the Indian Ocean, persisted. It was too vast, too decentralized, and too economically vital to be dismantled by a foreign fleet. The dhows, in their essential design, truly did outlast the sultans. They were the constant, the humble vehicles of a connection that flowed around political obstacles like water around a stone. But this maritime resilience was not exclusive to the sun-drenched Indian Ocean. To see a network operating in a world of starkly different values and volatile politics, we must sail north into the cold, mist-shrouded waters of the Viking Age. Here, on the shifting frontier between the North Sea and the Baltic, a port emerged that was less a city and more a calculated intersection, a ruthless and brilliant machine for exchange. This was Hedeby. Its location was its entire reason for being. Picture the Jutland Peninsula, that great thumb of land separating two seas. At its narrowest neck, a merchant with goods could face a brutal choice: a long and dangerous sea voyage around the stormy northern tip, or a short, costly overland trek. Hedeby offered a third path, a perfect shortcut. It sat on the Schlei Inlet, a deep, narrow fjord that stabbed inland from the Baltic Sea. From its docks, a merchant could unload his cargo, have it hauled just a few miles overland to the rivers that flowed into the North Sea, and reload it onto a different ship. This portage transformed Hedeby from a simple settlement into an indispensable pivot point, the ultimate entrepot. It was the turnstile of the north, where geography forced the world's goods to pass through a single, crowded gateway. And the goods that passed through were a catalogue of early medieval desire and dread. From the west came Frankish swords, finely crafted blades of pattern-welded steel that were the ultimate status symbol for a Norse warrior. From the vast eastern forests came bundles of luxurious furs, sable and marten, destined for the courts of Europe and the caliphates. From the Islamic world, traveling up the river routes of Rus, flowed a river of Arabic silver coins, the dirhams that became the primary currency of the Viking economy. And tragically, from the Slavic lands to the east came human cargo, captured individuals traded as enslaved people, a brutal commodity in a brutal time. Hedeby was a neutral ground for this volatile commerce, a place where rival chieftains and kings, who might be raiding each other's coasts one season, would meet to trade the next. Its harbour was not built of grand stone, but of practical, perishable wood, a material that ironically preserved its secrets for a millennium. Archaeologists have found its waterfront to be a dense forest of sunken logs and pilings, the foundations for wooden jetties and piers that extended out into the shallow water. Because the site is waterlogged with little oxygen to fuel decay, these timbers have survived in remarkable detail, along with leather shoes, woolen cloth, and even food waste, creating a time capsule of daily life. Each preserved plank, each jetty, was a cog in a machine designed for one purpose: rapid turnover. This was a port built for transshipment, for the efficient movement of goods from a Baltic vessel to a North Sea trader. Its very construction reflects a society that understood its role not as a final destination, but as a critical, thriving node in a network that thrived on motion. The power of Hedeby was not in a palace or a fortress, but in its position as the one place everyone, friend or foe, needed to do business. Hedeby's reign as the North's turnstile ended not with a whimper but a roar of flame. In the 11th century, a catastrophic fire swept through the densely packed wooden town, reducing its jetties and warehouses to ash and charcoal. The blaze was likely set during a raid, a violent punctuation mark in the region's endless power struggles. Combined with the relentless silting of the Schlei Inlet, which made navigation increasingly difficult, the fire proved a death blow. Hedeby was abandoned, its strategic location left to the reeds and the water. Yet if you listen to the broader rhythm of history, you hear something remarkable. The silence that fell over Hedeby's charred timbers was not a silence across the sea lanes. The hum of commerce simply moved. The networks that had converged on that one narrow neck of land were too valuable, too ingrained to simply dissolve. They reconfigured, flowing toward new, deeper harbors a short distance away, like Schleswig. The demand for furs, silver, and grain did not vanish with the town. It simply required a new, more robust framework. That framework would become one of the most powerful economic forces of the later medieval world, a formalization of the very principles that made Hedeby work. It was called the Hanseatic League. This was not an empire in any traditional sense. It had no emperor, no standing army, and no fixed capital. The Hanseatic League was something entirely novel, a decentralized commercial confederation, a network of cities that chose to bind themselves together for mutual economic advantage. Think of it as a guild, but on a continental scale. Ports and trading posts from London in the west to Novgorod in the east, from Bergen in the north to Cologne in the south, operated under a shared set of commercial laws and privileges. Their strength was in their unity. A merchant from Lübeck, the League's unofficial heart, could travel to the League's trading post or contour in far-off Novgorod and be protected by agreed-upon rules, stored his goods in a secured warehouse, and settled disputes under a known legal framework. This system drastically reduced the risk and cost of long-distance trade. The League negotiated treaties as a bloc, securing tax exemptions and legal protections from kings and princes who needed their goods and their shipping capacity. They built not harbors of stone, but a harbor of trust and common procedure that spanned northern Europe. The goods they moved were the lifeblood of the continent: Norwegian stockfish, Russian furs, Flemish cloth, and German beer, all circulating on Hanseatic cogs, sturdy ships that were the workhorses of the Baltic and North Seas. In this we see the ultimate systemic succession. The volatile, chieftain-centered trade of the Viking Age, which thrived in places like Hedeby, evolved into a stable, city-centered institution. The Hanseatic League did not invent the routes, it inherited and institutionalized them. It provided the predictability and scale that the earlier, more personal networks could not. And it proved astonishingly durable. It flourished for centuries, outliving the Viking kingdoms, surviving the Black Death, and navigating the complex politics of rival monarchies. Its power was purely commercial, yet it could wield it like a sword, imposing trade embargoes that could cripple a rebellious city or an uncooperative king. The League demonstrates the final stage in the life cycle of a resilient trade network, from an organic convergence of routes to a dominant nodal port, and finally to a formalized, self-governing entity that exists separate from any single political power. The harbors of the Hanseatic cities, many of which are still major ports today, were the new, permanent anchors for a system that refused to die. It was the logical, magnificent conclusion of a process that began when the first merchant decided that a connection was more valuable than a conquest. The physical cargo of a ship tells only half the story. When we sift through the layers of a buried harbor, we are not just finding goods, we are uncovering a cultural filter, a record of everything that hitched a ride on the tide of commerce. The most revealing evidence often isn't the grand artifact, but the humble, accidental traveler. Think of the ballast stones, the heavy rocks a ship would carry in its hold for stability when sailing empty. When that ship reached a foreign port and loaded up with silk or grain, it would dump these stones to make room. A geoarchaeologist can analyze these discarded rocks and trace them back to a specific quarry in Greece or a volcanic outcrop in Italy, mapping the ship's previous port of call with geological precision. Even more subtle are the ecofacts, the biological stowaways, seeds from foreign food plants preserved in the oxygen-starved harbor mud, tell us what sailors were eating and what crops they introduced to new shores. The tiny, fossilized remains of insects, species native to India or East Africa, found in the sediment of a Roman port, are silent witnesses to the global reach of these wooden vessels. They prove that trade ships were the original vectors of globalization, carrying not just products but entire ecosystems in their hulls and rigging. This cultural transfer went far beyond food and pests. A harbor was a revolving door for ideas. A single artifact can illuminate this beautifully. In the ruins of the ancient Egyptian Red Sea port of Berenice, a major hub for trade with India, archaeologists made a startling find, a small, delicately carved figurine of the Buddha. This object, created in the Gandharan region of modern Pakistan or Afghanistan, had traveled thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean. It likely belonged to an Indian merchant or sailor living in the Egyptian town, a personal item of faith that made the journey with him. It wasn't imported for sale, it was carried for comfort. Similarly, hoards of Islamic silver dirhams, stamped with the Arabic declaration of faith, have been found as far north as Viking Age Scandinavia. These coins were not just currency, they were tiny, mobile pieces of cultural information, their very inscriptions introducing a new script and a new religion to the north. They ended up melted down for Norse jewelry, but their origin story was woven into the fabric of Scandinavian society. What emerges from this accumulation of seeds, stones, and statues is the concept of a maritime cultural zone. This is a region unified not by a single ruler or a common language, but by the shared practices, technologies, and beliefs that flow along trade routes. A sailor in a Red Sea port might use a navigational technique developed in the Arabian Gulf, eat a meal flavored with Southeast Asian spices, and see religious iconography from 3 different continents in the same marketplace. The harbor, as the point of entry, acted as a blender for these elements. A shared maritime technology, like the lateen sail or the astrolabe, could spread from culture to culture because it solved a universal problem: how to master the sea more efficiently. These zones could be remarkably resilient to political conflict on land. 2 kingdoms might be at war, but their merchants, operating in neutral port cities, often found ways to continue doing business because the economic and cultural connections had become a force in themselves. The buried layers of a harbor, therefore, are an archive of this quiet, persistent integration. They show us that the most lasting export of any trade system was never just the spice or the silk, but the invisible cargo of ideas that subtly reshaped the world, one ship and one seed at a time. The real skeleton of a resilient trade network was not made of wood or stone, but of trust. A merchant in medieval Genoa could not simply sail to Alexandria with a hull full of wool, hoping to find a buyer. The risks were immense, from shipwreck to piracy to a foreign ruler confiscating his goods. For commerce to flow reliably across such distances, it required an invisible infrastructure, a set of social and legal frameworks that were as vital as any harbor. These were the operating systems of the ancient and medieval world, protocols that allowed strangers to do business with a handshake that spanned continents. Perhaps the most foundational of these was the law merchant, or lex mercatoria. This was not a legal code written by a king and enforced by his soldiers. It was a bottom-up system, a common law of commerce that evolved organically from the practices of merchants themselves across Europe and the Mediterranean. Its rules were based on custom, fairness, and swift resolution. Disputes were settled in special pea-powder courts, named from the French for dusty feet, which convened quickly in port towns to adjudicate issues before a ship had to sail. The principles were universal: good faith dealing, the sanctity of contracts, and the protection of debt. This legal framework created a predictable environment. A merchant from Venice knew that the basic rules of trade in Bruges would be familiar, governed by this shared commercial law rather than the whims of a local lord. It was a portable justice system that traveled with the goods, but law alone couldn't solve the problem of moving vast sums of money across dangerous lands. Carrying chests of gold coin was an invitation for disaster. The solution was a brilliant financial innovation: the bill of exchange, an early form of letter of credit. Here is how it worked. A merchant in Florence wanting to buy spices in Cairo would deposit money with a local banking family. They would give him a letter, a bill of exchange, stating that their agent or partner in Cairo would pay the equivalent sum to the spice seller. The merchant traveled with a piece of paper, not a fortune in gold. Upon delivery, the Cairo agent would pay the seller, and the two banking houses would settle the debt between themselves later, through a complex web of offsetting transactions. This system did more than just safety. It created a shadow network of credit and communication that was entirely separate from political borders. It allowed capital to flow where armies could not march. The agents in these far-flung cities were often part of tight-knit diaspora communities, groups whose very identity was built on long-distance connection. Consider the Radhanites, a network of Jewish merchants active during the early Middle Ages. Their routes stretched from the markets of France all the way to the court of the Tang dynasty in China. They moved not only goods like spices and silks, but also information, acting as a crucial communication link between East and West. Similarly, Armenian merchant communities established trading colonies from India to the Netherlands, maintaining their own language, churches, and internal governance. These groups were the human nodes of the network. Their shared identity, reinforced by family ties and common faith, created a powerful bond of trust that could enforce contracts across thousands of miles. A merchant was far less likely to cheat a business partner if it meant being ostracized by his entire community, his only source of identity and support in a foreign land. Alongside these legal and social systems were the shared maritime customs, the unwritten rules of the sea that every sailor from the Baltic to the Red Sea understood. Concepts like the law of wreck, governing salvage rights, or the duty to render aid to a vessel in distress created a common culture among those who braved the waves. These frameworks were remarkably portable and adaptable. When the harbour at Acre silted up during the Crusader period, the Italian merchant communes there simply packed up their charters, their accounting ledgers, and their legal traditions, and re-established their operations in Cyprus or Crete. The physical port was abandoned, but the commercial software it ran on was simply reinstalled on a new machine. This is the ultimate revelation from the buried harbours. The silt that filled their basins could not erase the Lex Mercatoria, could not sink a bill of exchange, and could not dissolve a diaspora. The most durable elements of these global systems were the intangible ones, the shared rules, financial instruments, and human bonds that turned the chaotic ocean into a highway of predictable exchange. The stones of the harbour provided the stage, but these invisible agreements wrote the play that outlasted every kingdom. These invisible systems of trust and finance operated within a larger, uncontrollable theatre, the global climate. A buried harbour is far more than a relic of commerce. It is a meticulous recorder of ancient weather. The same sediment cores that reveal layers of pottery and ballast stones also contain a hidden language of environmental history, written in pollen, mineral grains, and microscopic organisms. By reading this language, scientists can transform a forgotten port into a powerful paleoclimate proxy, a direct witness to the rains, droughts, and floods that shaped the fate of empires. This is where human ambition meets planetary force. Consider the process of sedimentation itself. a harbour core showing thick, rapid deposits of coarse silt and sand likely points to a period of intense erosion upstream. This could be the fingerprint of a decades-long drought. When vegetation dies off due to lack of rain, the bare soil becomes vulnerable. The next major storm event would then wash catastrophic amounts of earth into the rivers, which would carry it straight to the harbour basins, accelerating their burial. Conversely, a core showing very fine, thin layers of clay might indicate a long period of stable, moderate rainfall, where the landscape was held firmly in place by healthy plant life. The harbour would silt up slowly, predictably, giving engineers time to manage it, but the climatic signals go deeper than just dirt. Trapped within the sediment are the preserved shells of tiny marine creatures called foraminifera. Different species thrive in specific water temperatures and salinities. By identifying which species are present in which layers, researchers can reconstruct ancient sea surface temperatures, detecting periods of unusual warming or cooling that would have affected shipping routes and fishing grounds. Even pollen grains blown in from the surrounding landscape and settled into the harbour mud tell a story. A sudden decline in tree pollen and an increase in pollen from drought-resistant shrubs paints a vivid picture of a landscape under stress, a change that would have directly impacted local agriculture and the goods available for export. The harbour, therefore, becomes a climate station for the ancient world, logging data with a resolution that tree rings or ice cores from remote regions cannot match for a specific human-centered location. It directly links the planetary environment to the rhythm of daily life at the docks. A prolonged drought in the hinterlands of a port like Carthage would mean less olive oil and grain to load onto ships, diminishing its trade volume. The sediment record would show that economic slowdown alongside the geochemical signs of the drought itself. Alternatively, a period of exceptionally reliable Nile floods in Roman Egypt would guarantee bountiful grain harvests, filling the warehouses of ports like Alexandria and Myos Hormos to bursting. That prosperity would be recorded in the harbour layers as an abundance of ship ballast from across the Mediterranean, mixed with the fertile silt that made it all possible. In this way, the silent, filled-in basin of a harbour ties the grand narrative of human commerce directly to the pulse of the planet, proving that the rise and fall of trade was often a dialogue between merchant ingenuity and the forces of earth and sky. The term Dark Age conjures images of a world plunged into silence, a candle snuffed out after the fall of Rome. Yet the sediment cores pulled from Mediterranean harbours tell a different story, one not of darkness but of a changed light. The layers dating from the 6th to the 8th centuries do not show a clean, sharp end to commerce. Instead, they reveal a fascinating transformation, a shift from a single, blazing imperial sun to a constellation of smaller, steadier fires. Take the archaeological record from ports along the Italian coast. In the centuries immediately after Roman authority faded, researchers still find significant quantities of African red slip ware, a fine table pottery produced in North Africa. This wasn't a few heirloom pieces kept by elites, but ongoing, regular imports. The ships were still sailing from Carthage and other African ports to Italian shores. They just weren't necessarily sailing for Rome anymore. The centralized, state-sponsored Annona grain supply had collapsed, but the demand for everyday goods, for wine, oil, and pottery, did not vanish. The trade networks reconfigured to serve local markets and regional powers, like the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna or the rising Lombard duchies. The scale was smaller, but the pulse was still there. We see this adaptability in the harbours themselves. The grand imperial ports like Portus, dependent on massive state funding for dredging, inevitably silted up. But smaller, more manageable harbours, often with natural advantages, saw continued use. Places like Naples with its deep, protected bay, or the lagoon settlements that would one day become Venice, thrived in this new environment. They were nimble, capable of operating without the vast bureaucratic machinery of empire. Their success was built on regional exchange, connecting the remnants of the old world in new, pragmatic ways. This physical evidence forces a profound rethink of history's traditional narratives. The idea of a dark age is largely a literary construct, based on the decline of classical learning and large-scale political unity. From the perspective of the merchant, the sailor, and the local farmer selling his surplus, the story was one of change, not extinction. Long-distance trade in luxuries for the super-rich did decline, but the fundamental human activity of exchange, of moving goods to meet needs and opportunities, persisted. It localized, it transformed, but it never stopped. The Harbour mud records this continuity. A layer from the 7th century might contain fewer fragments of expensive marble from the Aegean, but it holds ample evidence of grain from Sicily, pottery from Tunisia, and wine from local Italian vineyards. This isn't a record of collapse, it's a record of a network learning to operate on a different voltage. The light of commerce didn't go out, it simply diffused, illuminating a more complex, decentralized map where resilience was found not in imperial command, but in countless local connections. The resilience of maritime networks finds a powerful echo far from the open sea, along the fertile banks of a river that was itself a liquid highway. To understand how trade systems flowed through the heart of continents, we must turn inland to a river port that became the pivot of two worlds. This is the story of Fustat, the original Islamic capital of Egypt, founded in the 7th century on the eastern bank of the Nile. Its strategic genius lay in its position as a perfect transshipment point, a continental turnstile. From its bustling harbour on the Nile, goods arriving by ship from across the Mediterranean could be unloaded. They were then transferred to camel caravans for an overland journey eastward, across the desert to the ports of the Gulf of Aqaba on the Red Sea. From there, ships could catch the monsoon winds to the Indian Ocean and the riches of the East. In reverse, spices, silks, and gems from Asia would follow the same path in the opposite direction. Fustat was the critical linchpin in this corridor, the place where the maritime world of the Mediterranean met the maritime world of the Indian Ocean, with only a desert crossing in between. Its harbour facilities on the Nile were not merely docks, but massive, organized warehouses and markets designed for this specific purpose, to unpack, repack, and redirect the wealth of hemispheres. The city itself grew fabulously wealthy from this role, a melting pot of cultures and goods where a merchant from Alexandria might bargain with a caravan master from Arabia. Yet Fustat's own story reveals the tension between a nodal city and the enduring route it served. Its decline began with a political decision, the founding of a new administrative capital just to the north, which we know today as Cairo. The center of political gravity shifted, and with it, royal patronage and investment. More decisively, the specific branch of the Nile that served Fustat's harbour began to silt up, a gradual process that made large-scale docking increasingly difficult. The combination of political neglect and geological change sealed the fate of the port district. But here is the crucial lesson: the trade corridor itself did not die. The demand for connection between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea was too great, the economic logic too powerful. The activity simply adapted, shifting to other Nile ports and overland routes that remained viable. The pathway that Fustat had perfected, the Nile-Red Sea corridor, remained a vital artery of global trade for centuries after the city's harbour fell silent, proving once again that the route could outlive the ruler, and the network could abandon a node without severing the connection. Political ambition has often looked at the map and seen not geography, but an obstacle to be conquered. When a natural trade route did not align with a ruler's vision, the solution seemed straightforward: use monumental engineering to carve a new one. Across history, from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Germany, empires have attempted to dig their way to commercial dominance by constructing artificial waterways, canals designed to bend the flow of goods to their will. These projects represent the ultimate test of political power against geographic and economic reality. The ancient pharaohs of Egypt, perhaps as early as the reign of Senusret III nearly 4,000 years ago, dreamed of a direct water link between the Nile River and the Red Sea. Such a canal would allow their ships to sail from the heart of Egypt directly into the Indian Ocean trade networks, bypassing the arduous overland caravan route through the desert. They made repeated attempts, digging channels that connected the Nile to the Bitter Lakes and from there to the Red Sea. For a time, these works functioned, celebrated as marvels of human will. Yet the victory was always temporary. The same relentless forces that buried harbors worked against these desert canals. Wind-blown sand and silt from the Nile's own floods would quickly clog the carefully dredged channels. Maintaining them required a permanent, expensive commitment of labor and resources, a constant battle against the landscape itself. When political focus shifted or resources grew thin, the desert quietly reclaimed its territory. The canal would silt up, becoming a shallow, useless ditch, a monument to ambition slowly erased by sand. Centuries later and far to the north, a similar story played out with different terrain. Around the end of the 8th century, the Frankish king Charlemagne envisioned a grand project to connect the river systems of the Rhine and the Danube. This water link, known as the Fossa Carolina or Charles's Ditch, was intended to create a seamless military and commercial corridor across the heart of Europe, binding his vast empire together. Thousands of workers began digging through the wet, clay-heavy soils of what is now southern Germany, but the geography fought back. The water table was too high, causing the excavation walls to constantly collapse. The clay soil turned into a sticky, impassable mire. After only a few months of grueling effort, the project was abandoned, leaving behind a partially dug trench that soon filled with rainwater and became a local pond. The path of least resistance for trade in that region remained the old, established overland routes and the separate river systems. The land itself had vetoed the emperor's decree. Even the sophisticated Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital at Baghdad, invested heavily in a vast network of canals in the Tigris and Euphrates basin. These were not for long-distance connection like the pharaoh's dream, but for intensive local agriculture and internal transport, designed to maximize the wealth of the Iraqi heartland and feed the colossal city of Baghdad. For a time, this engineered landscape worked miracles, creating a fertile garden that was the economic engine of the empire. But this system, too, proved fragile. It required meticulous, centralized management to prevent silting and salinization of the soil. As the Abbasid political structure later fragmented into rival dynasties, that centralized maintenance broke down. Canals clogged, fields were abandoned, and the agricultural base that supported the caliphate's power gradually withered. The grand network succumbed not to a foreign invasion, but to internal neglect and the inexorable logic of sediment and salt. What these ambitious projects reveal is a recurring pattern. A canal is a forced connection, an attempt to impose a political or strategic desire onto the landscape. Its long-term survival depends entirely on continuous, costly human effort to fight the natural tendency of waterways to silt up, shift, or revert to a state of equilibrium. When that sustaining political will falters, as it inevitably does with dynastic change, war, or economic shift, the geography swiftly reasserts itself. The silt settles, the banks erode, and the shortcut becomes a scar on the land. This contrasts starkly with the organic, resilient trade networks that grew up around natural harbors and seasonal winds. Those systems evolved to follow the path of least resistance, literally and figuratively. They used the monsoon cycles, the deep river mouths, the protected bays that the environment provided. They were partnerships with geography, not declarations of war against it. The most enduring trade systems were not engineered from the top down with slave labor and royal decrees. They were cultivated from the ground up through the accumulated knowledge of merchants who understood the rhythms of wind and water. A kingdom could order a canal to be dug, but it could not command the sea to accept it. The silent fate of these abandoned waterways stands as a testament to a simple truth: trade follows opportunity, not just orders. The story of resilient trade is not confined to the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean. Across the Atlantic, long before European sails appeared on the horizon, the Americas were woven together by their own sophisticated and enduring commercial webs. The evidence for these networks often lies in the same silent witnesses we have followed: harbors and ports now lost to time, buried by shifting coastlines or the profound changes that followed contact. On the sun-bleached northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, the ancient Maya built not grand cities, but specialized industrial ports dedicated to a single, vital commodity: salt. At sites like Imal and Chiquila, they constructed shallow evaporating ponds and thatched workshops right along the shore. Here, seawater was channeled and left to dry in the tropical sun, producing the salt that was essential for preserving food and sustaining health across the inland Maya kingdoms. These salt-making ports were the economic engines of a civilization. Their product traded up rivers and along jungle paths to great cities like Chichen Itza and Tikal. Yet today, many of these coastal sites are silent, their precise locations sometimes lost, their infrastructure reclaimed by mangroves and sand. Their burial is a testament to the dynamic nature of coastlines, but the need they served, the trade in this fundamental good, connected the highland and lowland Maya for centuries, outlasting the political fortunes of any single city-state. Far to the south, along the arid Peruvian coast, another indigenous empire engineered a trade system in harmony with a punishing environment. The Chimu kingdom, which flourished in the centuries before the Inca, faced a landscape of stark contrasts: fertile river valleys separated by vast deserts. Their ingenious solution was a network of canals and ports that turned the sea into their highway. They constructed artificial harbors at river mouths, using the freshwater streams to create oases of activity. More remarkably, they dug extensive canals that connected these coastal ports to inland agricultural centers and to other valleys. This allowed them to move goods by both land and small coastal rafts, creating a resilient, interconnected economic zone. Their trade moved prized goods like spondylus shells, harvested from warm Ecuadorian waters and considered sacred across the Andes, and finely worked copper artifacts. This system was so effective that when the Inca Empire eventually conquered the Chimu, they did not dismantle it. They absorbed and maintained it, recognizing the value of this pre-existing network. The ports and canals, though many later silted up or were abandoned, reveal a trade logic that transcended the kingdom that built it. These American networks operated on a logic entirely separate from the Old World, yet they reveal the same universal principles. The Maya trade in cacao beans, used as both a currency and a luxury drink, created a financial system that functioned across linguistic and political boundaries. The Andean exchange of spondylus shells, copper, and colorful feathers formed a cultural and religious economy that linked the Pacific coast to the Amazon basin and the high mountain valleys. These were not random exchanges, but structured, predictable systems that moved necessities and luxuries across thousands of miles. Their burial or abandonment was often the result of environmental shifts or the catastrophic demographic changes following European contact, not the failure of the trade concept itself. In fact, many of these routes and relationships persisted in altered form, even after the collapse of the grand political structures they once served. They demonstrate that the human impulse to connect, to specialize, and to exchange is a global constant. From the salt pans of the Yucatan to the canal ports of Peru, the ghost harbors of the Americas whisper the same truth as those of the Old World. Commerce can build pathways that remain open long after the gates of the kingdom have closed. The ghost harbors of the past are not relics of a lost world, but prototypes of our own. We are living inside the latest version of their story. Today's global supply chains are the direct descendants of those ancient maritime webs, a system of staggering complexity that moves goods with a fluidity that would astonish a Roman port official. The physical nodes have changed, of course. Instead of the hexagonal basin of Portus, we have the automated cranes of Shanghai or Rotterdam, stacking multicolored shipping containers like digital age amphorae. These mega ports are the modern world's indispensable turnstiles, the Hedebys of our time, where geography and engineering converge to force the world's products through a few critical gates. Yet they face their own forms of silting, not from river sediment, but from technological and economic obsolescence. A port designed for the largest ships of 20 years ago can become a bottleneck today, just as a harbor dredged for Roman grain ships became useless for medieval cogs. We see this in the constant multi-billion-dollar race to dredge deeper channels and build longer berths, a modern echo of the endless maintenance that once occupied the engineers of antiquity. The rise of new trade routes, like the expanding Arctic passages opened by melting sea ice, threatens to marginalize older hubs, rerouting global traffic as surely as the monsoon winds once shifted trade from Siraf to Harbours. The physical infrastructure, no matter how monumental, is always temporary, always vulnerable to the shifting currents of geography and need, but the true parallel lies in the system's intangible architecture. The ancient Lex Mercatoria has evolved into a labyrinth of international trade law and complex financial instruments. The bill of exchange has been digitized into instantaneous global wire transfers and blockchain-based smart contracts. The trusted diaspora communities are now multinational corporations and logistics firms, their bonds of trust encoded in algorithms and real-time tracking data. This digital and financial layer is the new hyper-resilient network, the operating system that allows a smartphone designed in California with components from a dozen countries to be assembled in Vietnam and delivered to a doorstep in Berlin within days. It is a system that demonstrates the same remarkable tendency to route around obstruction. A trade war between two nations might impose tariffs, but the network of capital and goods simply finds new pathways, rerouting shipments through third countries, adjusting supply chains, and innovating new financial vehicles to keep the flow moving. A pandemic or a natural disaster can shut down a major port, but the logistics software recalibrates in hours, sending ships to alternate harbors and rescheduling deliveries across the entire globe. The resilience is built into the data, not the docks. This reveals the core continuity across millennia. While individual corporations rise and fall, and government policies shift with elections, the underlying network of global exchange persists and adapts. It is a polycentric web of staggering scale, where the failure of one port, one company, or even one nation's policy is absorbed by the rest of the system. The capital, the information, and the demand simply flow elsewhere. Our modern world, for all its technological wonder, is still governed by the ancient principle, first written in the silt of forgotten harbors, that the pathways of connection often possess a longevity greater than the powers that momentarily oversee them. The container ship sailing into the Singapore Strait is following the same fundamental logic as the how that once entered the sheltered bay of Siraf, serving a network that exists beyond maps, beyond borders, and beyond the lifespan of any single flag that flies above its decks. Yet for all their remarkable adaptability, these networks were not invincible. There are moments in history when the lights across the maritime map do not simply dim or shift, but go out entirely. A true systemic collapse is a different order of event than the silting of a single harbor or the fall of one dynasty. It is a rupture so profound that the knowledge of the routes, the trust in distant partners, and the very memory of how to conduct such exchange can fade for generations. To understand the limits of resilience, we must look to a period of profound forgetting, a time when the Mediterranean itself seemed to shrink. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the interconnected world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near East experienced a stunning and rapid unraveling. This was not a slow silting but a cascading failure. The grand palaces of the Mycenaeans, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and the city-states of the Levant were burned, abandoned, or left to crumble. Literacy vanished in many regions for centuries, and crucially, the long-distance trade routes that had carried tin from Afghanistan to armories in Greece, or Cypriot copper to workshops in Egypt, simply ceased. This was a network collapse. It was not that one port failed and commerce rerouted. It was that the entire concept of regular, safe, long-distance maritime exchange across that sea became, for a time, impossible. What conditions could overwhelm a system's capacity to adapt? Historians point to a perfect storm of crises, a combination so severe it shattered the foundations of society itself. Environmental catastrophe appears to have been a primary driver. Tree ring and sediment core data from the period point to a prolonged, devastating drought across the eastern Mediterranean, lasting for decades. This drought would have led to crop failures, famine, and the large-scale movement of desperate populations. At the same time, evidence suggests a period of significant seismic activity, earthquakes that would have damaged vital port infrastructure and cities alike. Into this landscape of scarcity and instability came widespread societal unrest, often called the Sea Peoples in Egyptian records, groups who may have been both climate refugees and opportunistic raiders, putting further strain on weakened kingdoms. The final blow may have been the spread of pandemic illness, moving along the very trade routes that once carried wealth, devastating populations already weakened by hunger. This combination proved catastrophic. The centralized palace economies that controlled Bronze Age trade relied on stability, agricultural surplus, and a complex bureaucracy to manage distant exchanges. When the drought destroyed the agricultural base, the palaces lost their economic power and could no longer fund fleets or protect trade routes. When earthquakes and raiders destroyed the ports, the physical nodes were eliminated. When pandemic struck, it reduced the population of skilled sailors, merchants, and artisans. The system faced not one stress, but multiple, simultaneous, and reinforcing shocks. There was no quiet backwater port to shift operations to, because the drought and unrest were regional. There was no alternative network to absorb the traffic, because the collapse was systemic. The knowledge of how to build the large, oared galleys used for this trade, the intricate diplomatic ties between royal courts, and the geographical memory of distant sources for vital metals, all fragmented. The network didn't reconfigure, it dissolved. A much later and very deliberate example of network severance comes from the other side of the world. For over 200 years, from the 17th to the 19th century, Japan enforced a policy known as Sakoku, or closed country. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, nearly all foreign trade and contact were outlawed. Japanese were forbidden from leaving, and most foreigners were barred from entering, with only a tiny, highly regulated trickle of commerce allowed through the single port of Nagasaki with Dutch and Chinese merchants. This was a political decision to create isolation, a conscious uncoupling from global networks to ensure internal stability and prevent foreign influence, particularly from European colonial powers and Christianity. In this case, the network did not collapse from external shock. It was surgically disconnected by internal decree. The vibrant trade that had once connected Japan to Southeast Asia, China, and Portugal was deliberately dismantled. The harbors that had bustled with diverse ships fell silent or were repurposed for strictly domestic coastal shipping. the system of exchange did not adapt or find a new route, it was terminated by law. This isolation created a unique and insular cultural development, but it also meant Japan missed out on centuries of scientific and technological exchange occurring elsewhere. It stands as a powerful example of how political will, when absolute and enforced, can indeed strangle a trade system, proving that resilience is not an inherent law, but a capacity that can be deliberately negated. These episodes of true collapse or enforced isolation provide the necessary counterpoint. They show that while trade networks are often more durable than kingdoms, they are not supernatural. Their resilience exists on a spectrum. They can withstand the loss of nodes, the fall of empires, and even shifts in climate, if those stresses are sequential or localized. But when confronted with a synchronized, multi-front assault, catastrophic environmental change, pandemic, mass migration, and infrastructural destruction all at once, even the most polycentric web can tear. And when a powerful, centralized political authority makes the conscious choice to sever its own connections, the network can be forced into hibernation. This nuanced understanding deepens the mystery, making the more common story of endurance not a simple rule, but a remarkable achievement. It begs a final, reflective question as we look at the ghost harbors and the systems they served. What is the most fragile component in this entire ancient machine of exchange? The answer may lie not in the stone of the breakwater, but in the mind of the sailor. The mud of these silent harbors offers a final, unifying lesson, a set of principles that transcend geography and era. Across the case studies, from the coral causeways of Manda to the waterlogged pilings of Hedeby, a consistent pattern emerges, revealing what makes a trade system truly durable. The most resilient networks were never held in a single hand. They were polycentric and decentralized, like the Indian Ocean Web or the Hanseatic League, thriving on a multitude of independent ports, merchants, and routes. This structure created redundancy. When one node failed, whether from silt, fire, or political upheaval, the network simply reconfigured, its lifeblood flowing through alternative pathways. The system's strength was distributed, making it nearly impossible to kill with a single blow. In stark contrast, centralized, state-focused systems like the Roman Annona were magnificent but brittle. Built like a funnel to concentrate wealth and sustenance toward a single capital, their survival was tied directly to the political power that funded their relentless maintenance. When that central authority weakened, the entire engineered machine, from the dredging crews to the grain ships, ground to a halt. The harbor of Portus didn't just silt up, it was starved of its singular purpose. But the physical infrastructure, whether grand stone breakwaters or humble wooden jetties, was merely the visible tip of a much deeper iceberg. The most enduring elements of these ancient globalizations were the intangible ones, the social and legal operating systems that enabled trust across vast distances. The shared customs of the Lex Mercatoria, the financial ingenuity of the Bill of Exchange, the bonds of diaspora communities, these were the true skeleton of the network. A harbor could be buried, but these protocols were portable. They could be packed up and reinstalled in a new port, as the Italian merchant communes did when moving from Acre to Cyprus. They turned the chaotic, dangerous sea into a space of predictable business, a framework so valuable it outlived the kingdoms that rose and fell around it. Beneath even these human agreements lay the fundamental driver of all trade, economic complementarity. This is the simple, powerful reality that one region has something another region needs, and the exchange benefits both. The forests of the north had furs that the courts of the south desired. The monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean could reliably connect the spices of the east with the silver of the west. The Nile Valley produced grain that could feed 1 million people in Rome. This complementarity created a gravitational pull that political edicts could not easily negate. It is why trade often persisted even when the empires nominally in charge were at war. The underlying logic of need and supply created a force more persistent than any treaty or royal decree. So what, then, is the physical harbour? It is the tangible manifestation, the temporary hardware for these deeper and more persistent connections. It is the place where geography, complementarity, and human ingenuity momentarily crystallize into stone and wood. Its burial is not the end of the story, but a chapter break. The silt fills the basin, but the knowledge of the monsoon cycle, the design of the how, the map in the merchant's mind, these do not wash away so easily. They linger, ready to be reactivated when conditions allow, in a new location under a new flag. The ghost harbours teach us that while empires build monuments to their own power, the most lasting legacies are often the pathways they did not intend to create, the connections that become so essential they develop a life of their own. Yet the very resilience of these networks creates a profound modern challenge for those who seek to understand them. The most valuable harbours were built in the most strategically vital locations, and those places rarely stayed vacant for long. Today, the silent archives of ancient commerce lie directly beneath some of the world's most densely populated and dynamic cities. The ghost port of ancient Byzantium, later Constantinople, is entombed beneath the streets and neighborhoods of modern Istanbul. The legendary Heptastadion, the great causeway that once connected the island of Pharos to the mainland at Alexandria, now lies under centuries of urban expansion. In Mumbai, layers of medieval and early modern port activity are buried under the foundations of a sprawling megacity. This presents the archaeologist with a fundamental and frustrating dilemma: the conflict between preservation and interpretation. A complete, traditional excavation of these sites is almost always impossible. You cannot dismantle a modern metropolis to uncover the city that lies beneath it. This limitation forces a radical shift in methodology, turning every construction project into a potential and fleeting window into the past. Our understanding becomes an exercise in high-stakes puzzle solving, reliant on the very geoscience tools we have discussed and on a practice known as salvage or rescue archaeology. When a new subway line is dug in Istanbul or a new hotel foundation is poured in Alexandria, archaeologists have a brief, strictly limited opportunity to document whatever is revealed in the construction trenches. They are not leading the dig, they are following the bulldozers, working against the clock to record, sample, and interpret before the concrete is poured, and the opportunity is sealed away for another century. This means the evidence is often maddeningly fragmentary. A cross-section of earth exposed by a tunnel boring machine might reveal a stunning vertical slice of history, a clear line of dark, organic harbour mud packed with Roman pottery, but it is just a slice, a narrow keyhole view. Researchers must then correlate that single core or trench profile with other scattered fragments of data, perhaps a waterlogged timber found during sewer work a mile away, or a scatter of medieval coins unearthed during road repairs. It is like trying to reconstruct an entire novel from a handful of random paragraphs plucked from different chapters. This inherent fragmentation adds a powerful, final layer of mystery to the entire investigation. The buried harbours are not just physically hidden, their stories are deliberately obscured by the vibrant life of the cities that succeeded them. Our maps of these lost ports are therefore palimpsests in themselves, drawn with dotted lines and question marks, based on the echoes of ground-penetrating radar and the tantalizing clues from 100 disconnected salvage digs. We know the systems were resilient, but piecing together their precise anatomy requires reading between the lines of modern urban life, listening for the whispers of commerce in the rumble of a city that never sleeps. These buried harbours are not just chapters in a closed book, they are prologues to our own. The very forces that submerged ancient ports are accelerating today, rewriting coastlines and forcing a profound reconsideration of our relationship with the water's edge. As global sea levels rise due to contemporary climate change, the study of these lost sites transforms from a purely historical pursuit into an urgent, forward-looking science. The same waters that once buried harbors now threaten to expose and erase them, even as our own cities begin their slow descent into the archaeological record. This cycle of immersion and emergence frames our investigation not as a look backward, but as a critical lens for understanding a pattern of human adaptation and resilience that spans millennia. For archaeologists, the warming planet presents a paradoxical opportunity. Ancient harbors and settlements that have lain preserved for thousands of years in the cool, dark, oxygen-poor environment of the seabed are becoming more accessible for study. Rising seas and intensified storm surges are scouring away protective layers of sand, revealing structures that have not been seen since they were abandoned. In places like the Phoenician port of Tyre, parts of which are now permanently submerged, or the Neolithic villages off the coasts of Britain and Israel, these changes can expose incredibly well-preserved wooden pilings, stone foundations, and even organic remains like baskets or food. It is as if a museum vault is being unlocked by the ocean itself, yet this is a fleeting and destructive form of access. The same waves that reveal these sites also batter them with increased energy. Without the protective blanket of sediment, exposed timbers are attacked by marine organisms and eroded by currents. The very process of discovery can hasten their disintegration. This creates a race against time, where researchers must rapidly document and interpret these fragile windows into the past before they are washed away forever. It is salvage archaeology on a planetary scale, driven not by construction crews but by the changing climate. Conversely, the modern coastal megacities that now dominate the globe are, in a very real sense, constructing the buried harbors of the future. Consider the immense ports of Shanghai, Rotterdam, or Lagos. These are not just economic engines, they are vast, layered landscapes of human activity. Their foundations are built upon millions of tons of concrete, steel, and dredged material. Their seabeds are littered with the lost containers, discarded machinery, and cultural debris of our era. As sea levels rise, these cities face a stark choice: retreat or defend. Many are choosing to defend, investing in colossal engineering projects, sea walls, land reclamation, and elevated districts. This process of armoring the coast against the sea is, in geological terms, an act of rapid sedimentation and urban fossilization. The concrete barriers and pumped sand of today will become the distinctive, unnatural strata of tomorrow. A future geoarchaeologist, coring into the submerged plain that was once the Netherlands, might find a sharp layer of 21st century plastic polymers and corroded steel, followed by the silt of a deliberately drowned countryside, all resting atop the medieval peat. Our modern ports are not just places of trade, they are active sites of burial, creating the complex harbor sequences that will puzzle researchers 1,000 years from now. This long view reveals a sobering pattern of human coastal interaction. For most of history, societies have adapted to gradual changes in sea level with a flexible, mobile approach. When the waters rose slowly after the last ice age, communities simply moved their settlements inland, leaving their old homes to be swallowed by the sea. The Neolithic villages now underwater were likely abandoned in just this way. Later, with more investment in fixed infrastructure, the response was often to fight, to dredge, to build new harbors further out, as we saw with the sequential ports of Ephesus. Today, with trillions of dollars of immovable infrastructure lining our shores, our capacity for flexible retreat is severely limited. Our strategy is one of monumental defense. In this light, the study of ancient harbors offers more than historical insight. It provides a catalogue of long-term strategies, successes, and failures. It shows us societies that succeeded by working with the dynamics of the coast, and those that failed by fighting against them with unsustainable effort. The silted basin of Portus is a testament to what happens when the political will to maintain a forced relationship with the sea evaporates. Ultimately, the rising waters force us to ask what legacy we are building into the sediment. The ancient harbors tell stories of connection, resilience, and sometimes collapse. They speak of networks that outlasted kingdoms because they were adaptable, because they followed the logic of geography and complementarity. As we pour concrete and chart new shipping lanes in a melting Arctic, we are writing the next layer of that story. Will future researchers see our era as one of brittle, centralized infrastructure that succumbed to the rising tide, or as a moment of profound adaptation, where the network once again proved more durable than its nodes? The answer is being written now, in the policy decisions and engineering projects that will determine which of our coastal monuments become the next generation's ghost harbors, and which pathways of exchange manage to find a way to endure. The quiet mud of a forgotten harbor is a record of momentum. It preserves the proof that the most powerful forces in human history are not always the loudest, the ones that build palaces and wage wars. Often they are the quiet, persistent currents of connection, the simple act of reaching across the water to meet a need. These buried ports are not tombs of dead commerce, but monuments to a living principle. They are the physical, tangible evidence that the flow of goods, ideas, and people can develop a momentum all its own, a rhythm that continues even when the drumbeat of imperial power falters. The Roman state could vanish, but the Mediterranean still remembered how to trade. The Abbasid Caliphate could fragment, but the monsoon winds still carried merchants between continents. This is the profound legacy written in silt and stone, a testament to networked resilience. It shows us that the true architecture of civilization is not always found in its grandest buildings, but in its most essential pathways, the routes of exchange that become so vital they outgrow their original creators. Our modern world of instant communication and global supply chains can feel unprecedented, a sudden leap into a connected age. But the story of these lost harbors pulls back the curtain on a much deeper history. We are not inventing globalization, we are participating in its latest, most intense chapter. The container ships crossing oceans and the digital data flashing across fiber optic cables are following a pattern established millennia ago, a pattern of nodes and networks, of adaptation and persistence. The players and the technology have changed beyond recognition, but the underlying logic, the gravitational pull of economic complementarity, and the human drive to connect remains eerily constant. This long view invites a humbling and fascinating question. If an archaeologist 1,000 years from now were to study our era, what physical evidence would they use to understand our global systems? They would not find our treaties or our stock market charts. Those are ephemeral. They would look for the infrastructure of connection, the things we built into the earth and see that speak to our priorities. They might study the sunken foundations of our coastal megacities, the ghostly outlines of our submerged airports, or the strange, plastic-laden sediment layers we are creating in our oceans. They would analyze the global uniformity of certain materials, the way concrete and specific alloys appear in identical forms on every continent, just as Roman pottery or Chinese porcelain once did. They would trace the paths of our submerged internet cables, the silent, fiber-optic vines that now wrap the planet, and see them as the direct descendants of the monsoon routes and caravan trails. By mapping our buried harbors, we are learning to read the hidden architecture of human interaction, an architecture built not on conquest but on contact. It is a framework that has, time and again, proven more durable than the walls of any palace or the borders of any kingdom. It reminds us that while empires rise and fall with dramatic finality, the connections they foster, sometimes unintentionally, can have a life of their own, quietly shaping the world long after the last standard has fallen.